Hey everyone, this is a piece from In Defense of Marxism um, from Marxist.org uh, by Leon Trotsky, which is a collection of essays and letters and stuff like that, critiquing the minority opposition within the Socialist Workers' Party USA around James Burnham and Max Shachtman. Um, And this piece, and one of the fundamental cruxes of the Shachtmanite, or like one of the main components of the Shachtmanite split in 1939-1940, uh, is perspectives on the Soviet invasion of Finland, otherwise known as the Winter War. So before I read this, I am going to read uh, the Wikipedia article on the Winter War. The Winter War was a war between the Soviet Union and Finland. The Winter War began with a Soviet invasion of Finland on the 30th of November 1939, 3 months after the outbreak of World War II, and ended 3.5 months later with the Moscow Peace Treaty on the 13th of March 1940. Despite superior military strength, especially in tanks and aircraft, the Soviet Union suffered severe losses and initially made little headway. The League of Nations deemed the attack illegal and expelled the Soviet Union. The Soviets made several demands, including that Finland cede substantial border territories in exchange for land elsewhere, claiming security reasons, primarily the protection of Leningrad, 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. When Finland refused, the Soviets invaded. Most sources conclude that the Soviet Union had intended to conquer all of Finland, and cite the establishment of the puppet Finnish Communist government and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's secret protocols as evidence of this, while other sources argue against the idea of a full Soviet conquest. Finland repelled Soviet attacks for more than 2 months and inflicted substantial losses on the invaders in temperatures as low as negative 43 degrees Celsius, which is negative 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The battles focused mainly on Taipale along the Karelian Isthmus, on Kollaa in Ladoga Karelia, and on Raate Road in Kainuu, but there was also battles in Salla and Petsamo in Lapland. Following the initial setbacks, the Soviets reduced their strategic objectives and put an end to the puppet Finnish Communist government in late January 1940, informing the Finnish government that they were willing to negotiate peace. After the Soviet military reorganized and adopted different tactics, they renewed their offensive in February 1940 and overcame the Finnish defenses of the Karelian Isthmus. This left the Finnish army in the main theater of war near the breaking point, with a retreat seeming inevitable. Consequently, Finnish Commander-in-Chief Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim urged a peace deal with the Soviets while the Finns still retained bargaining power. Hostilities ceased in March 1940 with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty, in which Finland ceded 9% of its territory to the Soviet Union. Soviet losses were heavy, and the country's international reputation suffered. Their gains exceeded their pre-war demands, and the Soviets received substantial territories along Lake Ladoga and further north. Finland retained its sovereignty and enhanced its international reputation. The poor performance of the Red Army encouraged German Chancellor Adolf Hitler to believe that an attack on the Soviet Union would be successful, and confirmed negative Western opinions of the Soviet military. After 15 months of interim peace, in June 1941, Germany commenced Operation Barbarossa, and the continuation war between Finland and the Soviets began. So there's some context for this piece. The first section's titled "They Couldn't Foresee." quote, we, end quote, foresaw the alliance with Hitler, write Shachtman and Burnham, but the seizure of eastern Poland, the invasion of Finland, no, quote, we, end quote, couldn't foresee these events. Such completely improbable and utterly unexpected events necessitate, they insist, a complete upheaval in our politics. These politicians labored under the impression apparently that Stalin needed an alliance with Hitler in order to roll Easter eggs with him. They, quote, foresaw, end quote, the alliance, when, where, but couldn't foresee what it was for and why. They recognized the right of the worker state to maneuver between the imperialist camps and to conclude agreements with one against another. These agreements should, obviously, have as their goal the defense of the worker state, the acquisition of economic, strategical, and other advantages, and, if circumstances permit, the extension of the base of the worker state. The degenerated worker state attempts to gain these ends with its own bureaucratic methods, which at every step come into conflict with the interests of the world proletariat. But exactly what is so unexpected and so unpredictable about the Kremlin's attempt to get as much as it could from its alliance with Hitler? For our ill-starred politicians failed to foresee, quote, this, end quote, it is only because they fail to think a single question seriously through to the end. During the protracted negotiations with the Anglo-French delegation in the summer of 1939, the Kremlin openly demanded military control over the Baltic states. Because England and France refused to grant him this control, Stalin broke off negotiations. This alone clearly indicated that an agreement with Hitler would secure Stalin at least control over the Baltic states. Politically mature people the world over approach the matter from precisely this standpoint, asking themselves, just how will Stalin accomplish this task? Will he resort to military force? And so on. The course of events depended, however, a great deal more on Hitler than on Stalin. Generally speaking, concrete events cannot be predicted. But the main direction of the events as they actually unfolded contained nothing essentially new. Because of the degeneration of the worker state, the Soviet Union turned out at the threshold of the Second Imperialist War to be far weaker than it need have been. Stalin's agreement with Hitler had as its objective the securing of the USSR from a German assault, and generally securing the USSR from being drawn into a major war. While seizing Poland, Hitler had to protect himself on the east. Stalin was compelled, with Hitler's permission, to invade eastern Poland in order to avail himself of some supplementary guarantees against Hitler on the western boundary of the USSR. As a result of these events, however, the USSR acquired a common frontier with Germany, and by virtue of this fact, the danger from a victorious Germany became much more direct, while Stalin's dependence on Hitler was greatly increased. The episode of the partitioning of Poland had its development and sequel in the Scandinavian arena. Hitler could not have failed to see some intimation to his, quote, friend. Hitler could not have failed to give some intimation to his, quote, friend, end quote, Stalin, that he planned to seize the Scandinavian countries. Stalin could not have failed to break into a cold sweat. After all, this signified complete German domination of the Baltic Sea, of Finland, and hence constituted a direct threat to Leningrad. Once again, Stalin had to seek supplementary guarantees against his ally, this time in Finland. However, he met with serious resistance there. The, quote, military excursion, end quote, dragged on. Meanwhile, Scandinavia threatened to become the arena of major warfare. Hitler, who had completed his preparations for the blow against Denmark and Norway, demanded that Stalin conclude an early peace. Stalin had to cut his plans short and renounce Sovietizing Finland. These are the salient features of the course of events in the European Northwest. New section. Small nations in the imperialist network. Under the conditions of World War, to approach the question of the fate of small states from the standpoint of, quote, national independence, end quote, neutrality, end quote, etc., is to remain in the sphere of imperialist mythology. The struggle involves world domination. The question of the existence of the USSR will be solved in passing. This problem, which today remains in the background, will at a certain moment come to the forefront. As far as the small and second-rate states are concerned, they are already today pawns in the hands of the great powers. The sole freedom they still retain, and this only to a limited extent, is the freedom of choosing between masters. Two governments struggled for a while in Norway. The government of the Norwegian Nazis, covered by the German troops in the south, and the old social democratic government with their king in the north. Should the Norwegian workers have supported the quote democratic end quote camp against the fascists? Following the analogy of Spain, it might at first glance appear as if this question should be answered in the affirmative. In reality, this would be the crudest kind of blunder. In Spain, there was an isolated civil war. The intervention of foreign imperialist powers, however important in itself, nevertheless remained of secondary character. What is involved in Norway is the direct and immediate clash between two imperialist camps in whose hands the warring Norwegian governments are only auxiliary tools. On the world arena, we support neither the camp of the Allies nor the camp of Germany. Consequently, we have not the slightest reason or justification for supporting either one of their temporary tools within Norway itself. The very same approach must be applied to Finland. From the standpoint of the strategy of the world proletariat, Finnish resistance was no more an act of independent national defense than is the resistance of Norway. This was best demonstrated by the Finnish government itself, which preferred to cease all resistance rather than have Finland completely transformed into a military base of England, France, and the United States. Secondary factors like the national independence of Finland or Norway, the defense of democracy, etc., however important in themselves, are now intertwined in the struggle of infinitely more powerful world forces and are completely subordinate to them. We must discount these secondary factors and determine our policy in accordance with the basic factors. The programmatic theses of the Fourth International and War gave an exhaustive answer to this question 6 years ago. The theses state, quote, the idea of national defense, especially if the idea of national defense coincides with the idea of the defense of democracy, can most readily be utilized to dupe the workers of small and neutral countries, Switzerland, in particular Belgium, the Scandinavian countries, ... end quote. And further on, quote, only petty bourgeois blockheads, like Robert Grimm, from a godforsaken Swiss village, could seriously believe that the world war into which he will be drawn is a means for defending the independence of Switzerland, end quote. Other petty bourgeois, equally stupid, imagine that world war is a means for defending Finland, that it is possible to determine proletarian strategy on the basis of a tactical episode, such as the invasion of Finland by the Red Army. Georgia and Finland, new section. Just as during strikes directed against big capitalists, the workers often bankrupt in passing highly respectable petty bourgeois concerns, so in a military struggle against imperialism, or in seeking military guarantees against imperialism, the workers' state, even completely healthy and revolutionary, may find itself compelled to violate the independence of this or that small state. Tears over the ruthlessness of the class struggle in either the domestic or the international arena may properly be shed by democratic Philistines, but not by proletarian revolutionists. The Soviet Republic in 1921 forcefully Sovietized Georgia, which constituted an open gateway for imperialist assault in the Caucasus. From the standpoint of the principles of national self-determination, a good deal might have been said in objection to such Sovietization. From the standpoint of extending the arena of the socialist revolution, military intervention in a peasant country was more than a dubious act. From the standpoint of the self-defense of the worker state surrounded by enemies, forceful Sovietization was justified. The safeguarding of the socialist revolution comes before formal democratic principles. The Soviet annexation of the Soviet Republic, the annexation or the Sovietization of Georgia, I believe, was Stalin's project. Let me read this Wikipedia entry real quick. The Red Army invasion of Georgia. The Red Army invasion of Georgia took place between the 12th of February and the 17th of March 1921. It was also known as the Georgian-Soviet War or the Soviet invasion of Georgia, and was a military campaign by the Russian-Soviet Red Army aimed at overthrowing the Social Democratic Menshevik government of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, DRG, and installing a Bolshevik regime, Communist Party of Georgia, in the country. The conflict was a result of expansionist policies by the Russians, who aimed to control as much as possible of the lands which had been part of the former Russian Empire until the turbulent events of the First World War, as well as the revolutionary efforts of mostly Russian-based Georgian Bolsheviks, who did not have sufficient support in their native country to seize power without external intervention. The independence of Georgia had been recognized by Russia in the Treaty of Moscow, signed on the 7th of May 1920, and the subsequent invasion of the country was not universally agreed upon in Moscow. It was largely engineered by two influential Georgian-born Soviet officials, Joseph Stalin and Sergei Ordzhonikidze, who, on the 14th of February 1921, received the consent of Russian leader Vladimir Lenin to advance into Georgia on the pretext of supporting the alleged, quote, peasants and workers' rebellion, end quote, in the country. Russian forces took the Georgian capital of Tbilisi, then known as Tiflis, to most non-Georgian speakers, after heavy fighting, and declared the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic on the 25th of February 1921. The rest of the country was overrun within 3 weeks, but it was not until September 1924 that Soviet rule was firmly established. Almost simultaneous occupation of a large portion of southwest Georgia by Turkey from February of March 1921 threatened to develop into a crisis between Moscow and Ankara, and led to significant territorial concessions by the Soviets to the Turkish national government in the Treaty of Kars. Back to the text. World imperialism for a long time utilized the question of violence in Georgia as the rallying cry in mobilizing world public opinion against the Soviets. The Second International took the lead in this campaign. The Entente aimed at the preparation of a possible new military intervention against the Soviets. In exactly the same ways as in the case of Georgia, the world bourgeoisie utilized the invasion of Finland in mobilizing public opinion against the USSR. The social democracy in this case, too, came out as the vanguard of democratic imperialism, the unhappy, quote, third camp, end quote, of the stampeding petty bourgeois brings up the rear. Along with the striking similarity between these two instances of military intervention, there is, however, a profound difference. The present USSR is far from being the Soviet Republic of 1921. The 1934 Theses of the Fourth International on War declare, quote, the monstrous development of Soviet bureaucratism and the wretched living conditions of the toilers have extremely reduced the attractive power of the USSR for the world working class, end quote. The Soviet-Finnish War revealed graphically and completely that within gunshot of Leningrad, the cradle of the October Revolution, the present regime of the USSR is incapable of exercising an attractive force. Yet it does not follow from this that the USSR must be surrendered to the imperialists, but only that the USSR must be torn out of the hands of the bureaucracy. New section. Quote, where is the Civil War? End quote. Quote, but where is the civil war in Finland which you promised, end quote, demand the leaders of the former opposition who have now become leaders of the, quote, third camp, end quote. I promised nothing. I only analyzed one of the possible variants of the further development of the Soviet-Finnish conflict. The seizure of isolated bases in Finland was as probable as the complete occupation of Finland. The seizure of bases presupposed maintaining the bourgeois regime throughout the rest of the country. Occupation presupposed a social overturn which would be impossible without involving the workers and poorer farmers in civil war. The initial diplomatic negotiations between Moscow and Helsinki indicated an attempt to solve the question in the way it was solved with other Baltic states. Finland's resistance compelled the Kremlin to seek its ends through military measures. Stalin could justify the war before the broadest masses only by Sovietizing Finland. The appointment of the Kuusinen government indicated that the fate awaiting Finland was not that of the Baltic states, but that of Poland, where Stalin, no matter what the amateur columnist of the quote, third camp end quote, scribble, found himself compelled to provoke civil war and to overthrow property relations. 1 second. Otto Villa Kuusinen, taking a guess on that, I'm pronouncing that right, who lived from 1881 to 1964, was a Finnish-born Soviet communist and later Soviet politician, literary historian, and poet who, after the defeat of the Reds in the Finnish Civil War, fled to the Soviet Union, where he worked until his death. Otto Kuusinen briefly led the so-called the Finnish Democratic Republic before serving as chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Karelian Finnish SSR. The Karelian Finnish Soviet Socialist Republic, also called Soviet Karelia, or simply known as Karelia, was a republic of the Soviet Union. The Karelian Finnish Soviet Socialist Republic existed from 1940 until it was made part of the Russian SFSR in 1956 as the Karelian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. The latter became the Republic of Karelia, a federal subject of Russia, on the 13th of November, 1991. I just want to read 1 second. Where am I? I want to read also the introduction to the Soviet invasion of Poland. The Soviet invasion of Poland was a military conflict by the Soviet Union without a formal declaration of war. On the 17th of September 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, 16 days after Nazi Germany invaded Poland from the west. Subsequent military operations lasted for the following 20 days and ended on the 6th of October 1939, with the two-way division and annexation of the entire territory of the Second Polish Republic by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. This division is sometimes called the Fourth Partition of Poland. The Soviet as well as German invasion of Poland was indirectly indicated in the, quote, secret protocol, end quote, of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on the 23rd of August 1939, which divided Poland into, quote, spheres of influence, end quote, of the two powers. German and Soviet cooperation in the invasion of Poland has been described as co-belligerence. The Red Army, which vastly outnumbered the Polish defenders, achieved its targets, encountering only limited resistance. Some 320,000 Poles were made prisoners of war. The campaign of mass persecution in the newly acquired areas began immediately. In November 1939, the Soviet government annexed the entire Polish territory under its control. Some 13.5 million Polish citizens who fell under the military occupation were made Soviet subjects, following show elections conducted by the NKVD secret police in an atmosphere of terror, the results of which were used to legitimize the use of force. A Soviet campaign of political murders and other forms of repression targeting Polish figures of authority such as military officers, police, and priests began with a wave of arrests and summary executions. The Soviet NKVD sent hundreds of thousands of people from eastern Poland to Siberia and other remote parts of the Soviet Union in 4 major waves of deportation between 1939 and 1941. Soviet forces occupied eastern Poland until the summer of 1941, when Germany terminated its earlier pact with the Soviet Union and invaded the Soviet Union under the code name Operation Barbarossa. The area was under German occupation until the Red Army reconquered it in the summer of 1944. An agreement at the Yalta Conference permitted the Soviet Union to annex territories close to the Curzon Line, Curzon, which almost coincided with all of their Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact portion of the Second Polish Republic, compensating the Polish People's Republic with the greater southern part of East Prussia and territories east of the Oder-Neisse line. The Soviet Union appended the annexed territories to the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian Soviet Socialist republics. After the end of World War II in Europe, the Soviet Union signed the Polish-Soviet Border Agreement of August 1945 with the new internationally recognized Polish Provisional Government of National Unity on the 16th of August 1945. This agreement recognized the status quo of the new official border between the two countries, with the exception of the region around Bialystok and a minor part of Galicia east of the San River around Przemysl, Przeymys with an accent L, which were later returned to Poland. Back to the text. I specified several times that if the war in Finland was not submerged in a general war, and if Stalin was not compelled to retreat before a threat from the outside, then Stalin would be forced to carry through the Sovietizing of Finland. This task by itself was much more difficult than the Sovietizing of eastern Poland. More difficult from a military standpoint, for Finland happened to be better prepared. More difficult from a national standpoint, for Finland possesses a long tradition of struggle for national independence from Russia, whereas the Ukrainians and the White Russians were fighting against Poland. More difficult from a social standpoint, for the Finnish bourgeoisie had in its own way solved the pre-capitalist agrarian problem through the creation of an agricultural petty bourgeoisie. Nevertheless, the military victory of Stalin over Finland would unquestionably have made fully possible an overthrow of property relations with more or less assistance from the Finnish workers and small farmers. Why then didn't Stalin carry out this plan? Because a colossal mobilization of bourgeois public opinion began against the USSR. Because England and France seriously posed the question of military intervention. Finally, last but not least in importance, because Hitler could wait no longer, the appearance of English and French troops in Finland would have meant a direct threat to Hitler's Scandinavian plans, which were based on conspiracy and surprise. Caught in the vice of a twofold danger, on one side from the Allies and from the other, Hitler, Stalin renounced Sovietizing Finland, limiting himself to the seizure of isolated strategical points. The partisans of the, quote, third camp, end quote, the camp of the stampeding petty bourgeois, now pieced together the following construction. Trotsky deduced the civil war in Finland from the class nature of the USSR. Inasmuch as no civil war occurred, that signifies the USSR is not a worker state. In reality, there was no necessity whatever for logically, quote, deducing, end quote, a possible civil war in Finland from a sociological definition of the USSR. It was sufficient to base oneself on the experience in eastern Poland. The overturn in property relations, which was accomplished in eastern Poland, could have been achieved only by the state that issued from the October Revolution. I want to repeat that again. The overturn in property relations, which was accomplished there, could have been achieved only by the state that issued from the October Revolution. The overturn was forced upon the Kremlin oligarchy through its struggle for self-preservation under specific conditions. There is not the slightest ground for doubting that under analogous conditions it would find itself compelled to repeat the very same operation in Finland. That was all I pointed out. But conditions changed during the course of the struggle. War, like revolution, often develops abrupt turns. With the cessation of military operations on the part of the Red Army, naturally there could be no talk of the unfolding of civil war in France. Every historical prognosis is always conditional, and the more concrete the prognosis, the more conditional it is. A prognosis is not a promissory note which can be cashed on a given date. Prognosis outlines only the definite trends of the development. But along with these trends, a different order of forces and tendencies operate, which at a certain moment begin to predominate. All those who seek exact predictions of concrete events should consult the astrologists. Marxist prognosis aids only in orientation. I made the reservation several times as to the conditionality of my prognosis as one of several possible variants. To clutch now as the rock of salvation at the 10th rate historical fact that the fate of Finland was temporarily determined on the pattern of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, rather than the pattern of eastern Poland, can occur only to sterile scholastics, or the leaders of the, quote, third camp, end quote. New section. The defense of the Soviet Union. Stalin's assault upon Finland was not, of course, solely an act in defense of the USSR. The politics of the Soviet Union is guided by the Bonapartist bureaucracy. This Bonapartist bureaucracy is first and foremost concerned with that bureaucracy's power, the bureaucracy's prestige, the bureaucracy's revenues. This bureaucracy defends itself much better than it defends the USSR. The bureaucracy defends itself at the expense of the USSR and at the expense of the world proletariat. This was revealed only too clearly throughout the entire development of the Soviet-Finnish conflict. We cannot therefore either directly or indirectly take upon ourselves even a shadow of responsibility for the invasion of Poland, which represents only a single link in the chain of the politics of the Bonapartist bureaucracy. It is one thing to solidarize with Stalin, defend his policy as prime responsibility for it, as does the triply infamous Comintern, is another thing to explain to the world working class that no matter what crimes Stalin may be guilty of, we cannot permit world imperialism to crush the Soviet Union, re-establish capitalism, and convert the land of the October Revolution into a colony. This explanation likewise furnishes the basis for our defense of the USSR. The attempt of the conjunctural defeatists, i.e., the adventurers in defeatism, to extricate themselves from their difficulty by promising that in the event the Allies intervene, they will change their defeatist policy to a defensive one, is a contemptible evasion. It is in general not easy to determine one's policies according to a stopwatch, especially under wartime conditions. In the critical days of the Soviet-Finnish War, as has now become known, the Allied General Staffs reached the conclusion that serious and quick aid to Finland could come only through destroying the Murmansk Railway by bombing it from the air. From the point of view of strategy, this was quite correct. The question of intervention or non-intervention by the Allied air forces hung by a hair. From the same hair, apparently, the principal position of the, quote, third camp, end quote, also dangled. But from the very beginning, we considered that it was necessary to determine one's position in accordance with the basic class camps in the war. This is much more reliable. New section. No surrender to the enemy of positions already won. The policy of defeatism is not punishment of a given government for this or that crime it has committed, but a conclusion from the class relationships. The Marxist line of conduct in war is not based on abstract moral and sentimental considerations, but on the social appraisal of a regime in its reciprocal relations with other regimes. We supported Abyssinia not because the Negus was politically or, quote, morally, end quote, superior to Mussolini, but because the defense of a backward country against colonial oppression deals a blow to imperialism, which is the main enemy of the world working class. We defend the USSR independently of the policy of the Moscow Negus for two fundamental reasons. First, the defeat of the USSR would supply imperialism with new colossal resources and could prolong for many years the death agony of capitalist society. Secondly, the social foundations of the USSR, cleansed of the parasitic bureaucracy, are capable of assuring unbounded economic and cultural progress, while the capitalist foundations disclose no possibilities except further decay. What unmasked the noisy critics most of all is that they continued to consider the USSR a worker state at a time when Stalin was destroying the Bolshevik Party, when he was strangling the proletarian revolution in Spain, when he was betraying the World Revolution in the name of, quote, people's fronts, and, quote, collective security, end quote. Under all these conditions, they recognized the necessity of defending the USSR as a worker state. But no sooner did the same Stalin invade, quote, democratic, end quote, Finland, no sooner did bourgeois public opinion of the imperialist democracies, which covered up and approved all Stalin's crimes against the communists, the workers, and the peasants, raise a howl to the skies than our innovators immediately declared. Quote, yes, this is intolerable, end quote. And following Roosevelt, they declared a moral embargo against the Soviet Union. Educated witch doctor Burnham's reasoning on the theme that by defending the USSR we thereby defend Hitler is a neat little specimen of petty bourgeois fat-headedness, which seeks to force contradictory reality into the framework of a two-dimensional syllogism. There's a fucking typo here. I think it's supposed to be by defending the Soviet Republic after the Brest-Litovsk peace, did the workers support Hohenzollern, which is the nobility, or no, the monarchy of Prussia? Yes or no? The programmatic theses of the Fourth International on War, which deal in detail with this question, establish categorically that agreements between a Soviet state and this or that imperialist state do not place any restrictions upon the revolutionary party of that state. The interests of the world revolution stand above an isolated diplomatic combination, however justifiable the latter may be in and of itself. By defending the USSR, we struggle far more seriously against Stalin, as well as Hitler, than do Burnham and co. It is true, Burnham and Shachtman do not stand alone. Leon Jouhaux, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Jouhaux, I'm going to read his thing. Leon Jouhaux, was a French trade union leader who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1951. The notorious agent of French capitalism also waxes indignant over the fact that the, quote, Trotskyists defend the USSR, end quote. Who should be indignant if not he, but our attitude toward the USSR is the same as our attitude toward the CGT, General Confederation of Labor. We defend the CGT against the bourgeoisie despite the fact that the Confederation is headed by scoundrels like Leon Jouhaux, who deceive and betray the workers at every step. The Russian Mensheviks likewise are howling, quote, the Fourth International is in a blind alley, end quote, because the Fourth International still continues to recognize the USSR as a worker state. These gentlemen themselves are members of the Second International, which is led by such eminent traitors as the typical bourgeois mayor, Huysmans, and Leon Blum. Leon Blum is like the leader of the Popular Front government in France. Who's Huysmans? I don't know. Bourgeois Mayor Huysmans and Leon Blum, who portrayed an exceptionally favorable revolutionary situation in June 1936, and they made possible the present war. The Mensheviks recognized the parties of the Second International as workers' parties, but refused to recognize the Soviet Union as a workers' state on the grounds that at its head stand bureaucratic traitors. This falsehood reeks with brazenness and cynicism. Stalin, Molotov, and the rest, as a social layer, are no better and no worse than the Blooms, Jus, Citrines, Thomases, etc. The difference between them is only this, that Stalin and co. exploit and cripple the viable economic foundation of socialist development, while the Blooms cling to the thoroughly rotten foundations of capitalist society. The worker state must be taken as it has emerged from the merciless laboratory of history, and not as it is imagined by a, quote, socialist, end quote, professor, reflectively exploring his nose with his finger. It is the duty of revolutionists to defend every conquest of the working class, even though it may be distorted by the pressures of hostile forces. Those who cannot defend old positions will never conquer new ones. April 25th, 1940. One can't help wonder that, he says the Blooms, Jus, Citrines, and Thomases are no better and no worse. So it says right here that he said Stalin, Molotov, and the rest as a social layer are no better and no worse than the Blooms, Jus, Citrines, Thomases, etc. Trotsky at different points says that Stalinist system is worse than fascism. But I was just, just kind of speaks to like the contradictoriness of his whole position related to the USSR. I don't know, did the Blooms, Jus, and Citrines, and Thomases assassinate his son or kill him? The idea that like the Stalin post Great Terror, post like the brutality of collectivization, dekulakization, and breakneck industrialization is the same as these like compromised like social democratic and trade union figures, is a very I don't know. So it's something. All right. Well, it's April 25th, 1940, so we're getting nearer to Trotsky's death, which is like, what date did he die? I'm going to look it up right quick. What was his actual date of death? I know he died in 1940, but I don't know what day. And since we're in the month area of his, in his biography, we're months away from his death at least. Death date, Leon Trotsky. August 21st, and this letter was written when? April 25th. Alright. Well, thanks for listening.